Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Unlocking Security, the Power of a Strong Password Policy, presented by TCM Security's Development Manager, Matthew Twells. My name is Mariela Salinas, and I'll be assisting and moderating our session today. We are in Zoom for today's webinar, and we will be sharing a copy of this recording with you in an email after the webinar. We do encourage participation throughout the session, so please use the chat or the Q&A option for our short Q&A after the presentation. Educate 360 is so excited to present this webinar today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Matthew.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Yeah, as Maria said, it's Matthew Twells. I'm a business development manager for TCM now, but my background came around from I actually started off in the military. So password policies were actually really, really important for my previous life in the military because we it's all about protecting classified information. So a bit of a relevant career path for this webinar. But in general, a couple of years of consulting and engineering experience before that. Then went into auditing, so very much kind of all leading towards this subject matter in terms of a career history. What we're going to do is just go over sort of where passwords came from. They've been around much longer than you think. Kind of how we tended to use them, sort of how we got to what we understand as a password. We're going to go through some of the methods that attackers actually use to break them, and why they're so easy to guess half the time. And then we're going to start ending towards more of the organizational piece. So the people who run organizations, the system administrators, etc., who are responsible for managing this at scale, give you guys some advice on how to actually tactically take something away from this webinar to actually strengthen, or if you haven't got a password policy, potentially start working on writing one. First off, though, as all fun things do, we start off with a bit of a history lesson. So for as long as we wanted to keep things secret, we've had something that roughly, I'd say, approximates a password. Private communications have always required ensuring that only the right people actually have access to the information. And then there's this concept that underpins it all called authentication. Well, authentication is just proving who you say you are. You are claiming when you say I am Matthew Twells, I am making a claim to that identity. So you may understand Matthew Twells as business development manager. Someone might think of it as, oh, that's my friend. Adriana might be like, hey, this is my colleague from TCM. Those are different things, but they're all attached to one identity. So if I'm saying, oh, Matthew Twells wrote this, it could be three different people understanding the same entity created something. So when I claim to be Matthew Twells, that's actually an important claim that I'm making. I then have to prove it. So there's a way of proving that I'm Matthew Twells when I log onto my computer for work every morning, and that's usually some sort of password. So the actual interesting piece about passwords is they're actually older than physical locks. There's a lock, I believe it's a wooden pin tumbler lock, which is sort of the similar one that you would have on your front door, where there's a series of pins inside the actual lock itself. So when you turn the key, the ridges on the key push the pins up into different holes. And then when they all align, you can turn the key and it actually opens up the lock. There is a wooden one of those in a door, I believe, in the ruins of a palace in Iraq, which used to be a country called Assyria. So it's one of the oldest locks in the world. I believe much, much earlier than that, though, people used to use these things called watchwords. So there would be like usually military camps, or it would be some sort of verbal challenge. So whether it would be you just have to complete the sentence, or it would be something like potentially it could be something you would call it a password. You would need to know that word to understand, oh, I am a member of this group and thus am safe. I am not a foe, I am a friend. So that's where they're literally sometimes it's believed they've been around since ancient times, but that's why it's called a password. It's literally a word that lets you get past a guard, lets you get in somewhere. But in general, they offer a simple way to access protected information and protected spaces. Pretty simple as they go, but they have got a pretty big historical background. So I'm going to go through a bit of a timeline here. We used to use sort of pre-shared, when I call say a pre-shared key, normally in tech terms, we're talking about like a password or something digital, but genuinely for a long time, we used to literally share out the keys to doors, to places. And that was your way of authenticating. You literally had a pre-shared key that let you into the door. If you had the key, you could get in. Obviously, that has its weaknesses, especially when people were able to kind of make their own. There's also these little, they're kind of usually pots or sort of pieces of pottery or rocks or some sort of coin called tessera, and the Romans actually used those as pre-shared keys. You could actually use them. It was sort of the oldest form of multi-factor authentication that existed because they not only had to have that password to get into the camp, they actually had to have the little tessera to go with it. Then in medieval times, if anybody's ever watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail, they'll probably be familiar with the scene where where King Arthur's trying to get into the castle, and is roundly mocked by the French person that sat on the wall. In general, though, it's referencing kind of a challenge and response mechanism that used to be an easy way of instead of having me going to go down to the gate, potentially putting myself in danger, I could shout some sort of challenge to them, and if the soldier shouted a effective response back that was like, "Yep, I know that person is a friendly, or that person is part of me, of my group," then I could let them in. Merchant guilds, I'd say around the kind of Venetian times, used them as well, but they used to use handshakes instead. So it was kind of a different form of authentication, imperfect, but it was still technically a password. It was some sort of identifying gesture, identifying because if you're using the same set of actions, it's still technically sort of a passphrase. You would categorize it along something along those lines. So again, medieval times we were using sort of multiple forms of authentication. Some groups were asking for multiple types at the same time. So these concepts aren't as new as we think they are. What we understand as a password, though, actually came around in about 1960s, the early to mid 1960s. MIT, Fernando Carbato, developed the first digital password system as computer networks started to exist. Ironically, it wasn't actually for security when they started making them. He actually used it to track usage time. So it's ironic that the first computer password wasn't actually even for securing the device that it was put on, which I always thought was amusing. Today we have passwordless architecture. We have biometrics. We can scan if anybody's ever used Face ID. It's using complex biometric factors. I've seen sign-in devices that take vein prints of your hand. We've got multi-factor on almost everything. If you've got a list of text codes on your phone, as long as you're on. It's something now I think has become fairly ubiquitous. So passwords have become a lot more complicated, a lot more widespread. You need to set one up for almost anything these days. First of all, then let's go through sort of the process of making, guessing, and then breaking passwords. So making them has always been a bit difficult, especially if you've had to set up a new one. Whether you found yourself in a data breach list, unless you got like a notification, such as like the United Healthcare hack. A lot of people got a message saying like, "Hey, you should probably change your password for these kinds of devices and these kinds of applications that they use to help administrate." But I'd say probably the most I'd say 20th century version where this really came in handy was during the Prohibition era. So if you say you owned a speakeasy back then, people were obviously chasing um, people trying to sell and distribute and consume alcohol while it was illegal. You'd need to control access. You don't want the police coming in, raiding you. But if you're running the place, you can't personally check everyone at the door. So that kind of rules out a very one-to-one, I don't know this person, they can't come in. So we need some way of administrating access, which again, you'll start seeing quickly why this password started becoming and authentication generally became so important. So what you do instead is I'm going to create a secret phrase to give to the guard or the bouncer, and I'm going to share it only with the desired guests that I want to come in. If you have it, you're allowed in. So this would become a pre-shared key, a pre-shared password. The issue here is that we have a real problem here. And that problem is, what if someone overhears, or worse, guesses it? I have told that guard that if someone has this password that they are allowed in, that could include potentially a policeman or someone that is looking to shut down my speakeasy. So that's a real problem. And what we would call here is this is something that's actually a real fundamental problem in passwords and kind of security in general, which was called the key transmission problem. How do I get a key to you that I am pre-sharing for access? How do I stop it being intercepted? If it is intercepted, what do I do about that? Getting around that and all the mechanisms that we put together are pretty much the basis for how we can shop online securely, how we can do almost anything that would normally require your in-person presence for security reasons. The reason you can now do it online. So we got to make a phrase. We've got to give something fairly secure to the bouncer. So what are we going to do? I'm probably not going to go with secret bar password 2025. It's pretty obvious. If I've got a secret bar, having secret bar password 2025 isn't much better than the word password. I could try and misdirect someone, do a double bluff. I could try mystery beer place 2024, change the year a little bit, add some sort of similar words, some synonyms, thinking they're going to think that it's going to be vastly different as opposed to pretty similar. I could try and throw people off that way. We could try something personal. If you've probably noticed from my accent, I'm British by descent, but I could try hip. That's British 1991, which is the year I was born. If they don't know that, but the people I want do, that might be a good choice of passwords. But fundamentally, these all have the same issue, which is they work when there's one-to-one. There's a person validating that password, one bouncer, one guard, one person on the door that's actually protecting you against this kind of stuff. You can't try the same password 100 times in front of someone real. They would just kick you out. They would know after a few that you're just guessing. This doesn't really work when you start moving into digital world. There's different challenges than in person. You're just able to do things with modern technology like cloud services and devices called graphical processing units, which you find if you've got a friend or yourself have a large graphics card in your computer at home. That usually it's used to run graphics. There's calculations that predict or assign where the pixels go onto the screen. You can actually use those as a way of setting it up and sort of redirecting all that effort to guess passwords. It can generate lists of candidate passwords and check them billions at a time. We can go for billions of passwords guessed in a minute. Lots of new modern GPUs have hundreds or thousands of cores in them, and what we can do is not only can each core guess millions of passwords, they can work in parallel as well. So it's just the math becomes exponential really, really quickly. So it's just a different ball game when it comes to digital passwords. So we actually kind of have to think about it a little more. We can't just come up with something simple. And usually as well, if we've got more than 20 or 30 people, a pre-shared universal key between all these people also stops working because if someone's broken it, then it's broken for everyone. What I would normally want to do is sort of limit the blast radius of someone's password being compromised. So what I would do is have a unique password for everyone instead. So I not only have to manage a ton more passwords, if I've got 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people coming to say a larger building, these things that worked when it was just one bar don't work anymore. There are three main tactics that are used to break passwords these days. We're going to go through a few of them today. This first one we're going to look at is called brute forcing. So brute forcing is kind of what it sounds like on the tin. Brute forcing is essentially guessing every combination of characters that there is. I think there's roughly somewhere between 90 and 95, 96 combinations of characters on a normal keyboard. So that's all of the letters, that's both uppercase and lowercase, 0 to 9, and all of the different sort of Unicode or sort of the symbols, so question marks, exclamation points, etc. So what that means is that there's millions and millions and millions of different combinations of those. But again, as we mentioned with the GPUs, just lining them up and going 0000001, 0000002 would have taken years back in the 2000s. But if you can just rent that power from something like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, or you happen to have what people in the industry would call a rig, which is lots and lots of GPUs linked together to sort of be a computer that's just for this purpose. It can turn what would have taken 3 years back in 2000 into a couple of minutes. Like you could go and make a cup of coffee and come back and it would have broken. So yeah, I think it's one of the stats I wrote down here was that a password that would have taken 3 years back in 2000 is now I think crackable in about 3 to 4 minutes, which is just an exponential drop in the amount of time it takes to crack these things in real life. So yeah, new technology has made this attack very cheap and very easy to do. And the worst thing is it's something you can actually run offline. So you could actually be doing worse stuff as an attacker whilst this kind of attack is working. So in terms of effectiveness, brute forcing is again, it's kind of a blunt instrument when it comes to it's not really adding any context, which you'll start to see is really important here if you want to start guessing these a lot faster. But the simpler a password is, and the more time and try an attacker has, the better this approach works in general. So the next kind of attack where I'd say we're going up a little bit in sophistication, not by much, it's called a dictionary attack. There have been dozens, as I'm sure you guys are all aware, of previous hacks, previous breaches. There's been enormous ones from T-Mobile over the years. Almost every large company has had some sort of issue with this, but in general, those dumps of passwords and dumps of user information don't just disappear into the ether. They end up on something called the dark web, where people who trade in this information will meet up and sell large quantities of this information as I think something along the lines of about 1.5 billion passwords is the sort of compiled password dump that people use. Security professionals like the ones at TCM Security use these as well as part of our password audit service, which is where we kind of do this as a sort of simulation as opposed to an actual attack maliciously on someone. But in general, the tactic of a dictionary attack is that much like a dictionary, it doesn't have every word in the English language, but it does have most of the common ones and the different permutations and what they mean. And a dictionary is something where I would compile a list of likely passwords. So I'm going to use a little bit of context here. So it might be something simple, like if I'm not going to use the word elephant, I might try and be clever and add my birthday. So it's going to be 1992, 1993, 1994, etc. Maybe even the months too. Then you can also do something called mangling. This is all pre-programmed into a lot of the programs that we use to crack these in real life. But mangling is, as you can see in the brackets here, is when you sort of mess with the words, where you use sort of numbers where they could approximate a letter, or as I've seen here with the at symbol. Most people will understand that reading it with an at. But in general, this is designed to make things more complicated. So, you'd think that the computer is going to guess that you're saying elephant with an E, when if you're using a three for one of them, that's going to take it just that much longer to crack. That certainly used to be more effective. Not so much anymore, because a lot of these simple words, if your password is in one of these data breaches, it will just be in there as one of the ones that are guessed. So this context is more history of actual dumped data, but also just some of the simple tricks where people are trying to add, like 1995, 1996. It's not difficult to just kind of work out what the computer using age is going to be. It's going to be somewhere between the ages of somewhere between sort of 12 and 70. And I just put all those years into this. It takes a couple of seconds for a device like a GPU to go through. It's not particularly effective anymore like it used to be. Statistically, most vulnerable when it comes to dictionary attacks are people using sports teams, birth years, and any kind of permutation of their name. These are some of the simplest ones, and there are definitely programs out there that would actually prey on this tactics specifically. So social engineering is probably the one you probably recognize a few of these that are on screen. These are you've seen them on Facebook, you've probably seen them on Twitter. They are everywhere on social media, but specifically with platforms that trend older in usage, just because of how effective these are. The best person to ask if I'm going to try and get your password is you. If I just come up and ask you for your username or password, most people are clever enough not just to give it. So they try and trick it out of you. And this simple, I need to trick the information or induce you, as we call it, to give me that information is the whole science of social engineering. It's an entire service. In a lot of companies, it's a easily one of the most effective when it comes to breaching some of the largest organizations. The recent Las Vegas hack of the Caesar's Palace, I believe, was social engineering enabled. So it's something that it's not just something that people are doing to try and get a couple of dollars out of small people. It's they used it to breach enormous organizations. In general, the social engineering that's probably happening most wide is this kind of gamified version where it's, there's a questionnaire or it's a game like, what was the car that you passed your driver's test in, which is your first car? Or it'll be like your stripper name is if you put your first pet's name plus your maiden name. You'll notice that these are a lot of the questions that tend to be security question answers when you need to reset a password, which is then the basis of an attack called account hijacking, which we'll go into in a bit. What I can do with social engineering, though, is with this kind of information, I can start putting together a dossier of various kind of what I call biographic information on you. So, where were you born? Where do you live? If that's not just on Facebook anyway, and I could just harvest it regardless because you've shared it yourself. But these kind of memes, these surveys, these questionnaires are probably the thing you'd want to watch out if you take nothing else from this webinar. A lot of these are being harvested and added to databases. They certainly aren't as innocuous as they look. Very much, if you see one of these, definitely do not answer them. One of the most effective ways, though, that passwords are used, or credentials in general. So the password is part of, it's coupled with your username and a token or some sort of like, sometimes it's a phone app, you use like a Microsoft Authenticator. Sometimes it's a text code. But in general, that set of information about you, it means that I am claiming to be Matthew Wells. I give my password out. And then I also have the text code, which means I have the phone that's associated as the second form of authentication. Together, I am then not just making the claim that I'm Matthew Twelves, but I'm also authenticating that claim. I actually could only be him because I have my password. And you're going to need to get into most modern systems some way of getting around that. I don't just need the password. I need to know who he is. I need to know what username he uses. And one of the easiest ways to do this at scale, and this is probably the most dangerous cyber attack out there, is phishing. Phishing here is really it's one of the simplest attacks out there, but one of the most dangerous because once you've given it to them, why would a system be set up to track valid access? It's your credentials, so it's nothing that would actually trigger most security systems because you were meant to log in. You're an employee. But if it's not you using those credentials, then it becomes very dangerous because a lot of those defenses that are used to track intruders wouldn't trigger. So most people, though, again, if I ask you to give me your work password and everything like that, you probably wouldn't give them to me. So I need to find some way of tricking you to give them to me. So an attempt to give you to get you to enter those devices, to enter my credentials into my system, it's called a phishing attack. And these are probably something you've seen in your cybersecurity awareness training. But modern phishing has evolved well beyond the kind of obvious scams where it's like, hey, I'm trapped in this country and I need 17 Bitcoin to get me out. Can you send this to me? These ones are harvesting information for how your company writes at scale. They'll certainly take things like where they'll find and just if they're dwelling within a network, they might just harvest emails just so they know how people write to then mimic that at scale. So you when you really would have to know context wise whether this email makes sense because you're not going to spot it from obvious spelling mistakes or domain issues. So you might not be just be like, hey, at hotmail.com and we use at tcmsec.com, for example, here. It's getting a lot harder where honestly, I don't blame a lot of people for having difficulty spotting them these days. If you ever read most highly sophisticated cyber attacks when you see them online, it is usually honestly just successful phishing. There are few more effective attacks that will let you pilfer data at an enormous scale than just taking someone's valid details. People do this all through things like setting up fake websites. It'll be sometimes pretending to be tech support. It could be all manner of things. The attackers are getting really, really good at this. Um, this attack is something you do once you actually have the passwords. So once we have credentials and we have attackers, there's an attack that we actually use as part of our work at TCM Security called credential stuffing. Sadly, not the fun kind that's in the picture. But what we do is we have a valid password and a valid set of credentials, and we'll take a set of other common services and exploit password reuse. I certainly used to be horrible for this before I got into cybersecurity, where I had one good password and I just used to use it across everything because I just didn't have the brain power to remember anymore. The issue is as you probably noticed, if I have broken one password on my work computer and I happen to be using the same one for my Amazon account and my Netflix and my credit card payments, very quickly that one breach just became four for me, and it's very, very bad for me personally. So it's an attack credential stuffing. It's a simple one, but it can be incredibly dangerous very quickly if you're someone that reuses passwords. A lot of people will, sort of act high and mighty and say, "I'd never do this." Once you've had to come up with your 70th unique password, people do start to use sort of small variations, which are easy to program into these kind of credential stuffing attacks as well. Which is one of the reasons why we go into trying to make coming up with these passwords a bit easier. But we'll go into that in a minute. So this is how attackers actually use the credentials once they have them. So if they've either bought them or they've managed to find them, or worse, that they've harvested them off you, you can sometimes dump entire groups, entire companies worth of passwords. But what in most modern networks, you're not actually, when you type in your password, you're not sending the password itself. So if I type in my password and say it's cat12345, cat12345 is not going to the system that's checking my password. What my operating system is doing, so you assume it's Windows, is they take that password, that cat12345, and they turn it into a number. It's a value called a hash. And that hash is compared to a hash of the original password that you use when you set it up. And if those hashes match, then I know what's been entered into the login screen matches what's in the system, and I'm allowed in, which means that I'm never actually sending the password over the network. What you can do, though, with enough access to the network is dump those hashes out of those systems if you have access to the right computers. There are two things you can do with that. I can either spend some time and some computing power trying to crack those passwords, which I'll go into in a second. But one of the simplest things we can do, especially in Windows networks, is use something called Hashcat, which I can use to process billions of combinations per second, use something like a GPU. And what I think 30 to 50% of corporate passwords that we find can usually be broken in between a few hours and a day. Unfortunately, password is still in 2022 the fourth most common password, just the word password. And I believe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 was sixth. So we're not getting much better when it comes to creating our own passwords. Hashcat, though, is something that uses that GPU. It's a program that uses that GPU power to actually do that brute force guessing, and it can then pre-program a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. One of the other things you can do as well is if I just have the hashes and the operating system will take them, I can just try and provide the hash without ever knowing the password. There are some older versions of Windows that will just let me do that. That's called a pass the hash attack. It's still very effective if people have not taken the time to actually defend specifically against this attack. I'll go through these slightly quicker just because something that it's more just trying to take the general gist of rather than the specific math here. But like you said before, so about 94 possible characters in play on a normal keyboard. So it's letters, numbers, symbols. If your password is 6 characters long, it's got roughly 689 billion combinations of those. That's a lot, and it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But it was back in the 2000s. Right now, if a modern GPU can guess a billion passwords a second between hundreds of cores, you can kind of do the math there. That gives you 689 seconds to essentially either change your password or until that password is cracked and turned back into what we call plain text, which is something I could read as a human. If you double that password to 12 characters, you end up with 474 quintillion combinations of characters. If you every one of those is a second, that's actually older than the universe has been around. So adding 6 characters took this from I can cook pasta in this time to you are just never feasibly cracking this password at any time. And that was just adding characters. But in general, too short is one of the worst things that you can do to a password. If you do nothing else, add characters. It genuinely, the graph is dramatically goes up exponentially with difficulty the more characters you have in a password. The other one, as the song You're So Vain, attackers probably think that password is about you. And normally they would be right statistically. We tend to use personal information. It's easy to remember. It's about us. But attackers know that and are banking on you being lazy. Many of us are using obvious factors that maybe we're not using our specific personage, we're not using our wife's name or our dog's name, but it could be college, hometown, birthday, birth year, pet names, common first cars. A lot of people overshare on social media, and collecting this information is completely trivial at this point for attackers with a budget and a time scale to come after you. Usually, a lot of this information is freely offered on a lot of social media sites. So a tip, if you take nothing else away from this deck, make it this one. Building a strong individual password that you can use. Obviously, don't reuse the same one across. That kind of makes reintroduces the credential stuffing risk that we talked about earlier. But it's actually not as hard as you think to come up with an individual password that's really strong and hard to crack. Choose three random funny words that sound funny put together. So something that just like that's a dumb mental image, or it's something that just makes you smile or laugh when you think about it. So I picked one here. It's elephant, stapler, jazz. Kind of had the idea in my head of an elephant playing a couple of staplers, like a set of castanets, in a jazz club. That's an image that will stick in my head. But just with that, I'm at 19 characters. So we're already got a difficult password to crack here. It's also nothing biographic about me, so it's not something you'd guess if you just happen to access my LinkedIn or any of my social media profiles. Another really easy thing, do this immediately next time you have to reset your password, is just use a trailing or leading space or two. Spaces in a lot of systems count as passwords. They count as part of the characters that go into passwords, but they're almost never in any dumped password lists. The extra characters that you get just from hitting spacebar twice at the end or afterwards or beginning dramatically increase how difficult that password is to crack, not only because they won't be in the lists, so it has to be guessed organically, but also just it's an extra character, which means you're adding an extra set of combinations that set the number into the stratosphere afterwards. It's just one of the easiest things you can do to make your passwords more secure. And then, much as we said before, it's not great on its own, but you can also mangle the password by, as I've done here, with the three for the E, the at symbol for the ant, for the A letter. I've put one for an L. You're going to understand elephant stapler jazz here because it's a fun phrase, but I can also know for myself that I'm replacing E's with threes, at symbol for A's, one for L's, and then I know to do that myself. This at the bottom at number three is actually a very difficult password to crack, but it's easy to remember. But now you've got to get the whole company to follow your lead. That's much, much harder than it looks. You're going to need to balance security with user experience here. So you can't suggest 28 character passwords, and you can't rotate them every 12 hours. And you need to ensure that these requirements work across all systems consistently. You can't have something that only works on a very obscure operating system that only you have. It needs to work on almost everything all of the time. And also applying policies to everyone. One of the hardest things to do as a system administrator, I found, were officers and people in senior management that found that it was annoying and wanted exceptions to these kind of password policies. And unfortunately, they are the prime targets for this kind of attack that we've been going through. Components of a good password policy. If you haven't written one before, they are not as difficult as you as expect. You really just need to write down what you'd want and then just set out what a good password should look like. Because then you can put this kind of information at something like group policy on Windows and enforce it through systems, which is the ideal implementation of a policy where it's not relying on human cooperation. It's actually coded into the computer. So here, minimum passwords, 12 plus characters. Hopefully you understand why that's a recommendation now. You want to require special characters, mixed cases, password rotation. Usually the sweet spot is about 90 days. 90 days is enough that I don't have to keep thinking of password changes. It's 3 months is a fairly long time, but it's also stops user frustration building up. You want to stop password reuse. Someone, unfortunately, who was horribly guilty of this back in their early career. I was horrible for just changing the year at the end of a password. I understand now in cybersecurity that that's a really bad thing to do, so I don't do that anymore. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't. You want to prevent pattern variations like this in the policy itself, so you never end up in this position in the first place. And if possible, in your system allows you to mandate using something like Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, or a text code of some kind through a system like Twilio, use it. It's a easy step that if you're able to do it, if people find it annoying, sure, good security should be a little annoying, but it reduces the reliance on just the password alone. It means you need to have another device, another thing to break in, and it could be the thing that stops someone successfully breaching your company. One of the last slides here is just writing a good policy statement. It's actually really hard to do this at scale, but as you can see here, all I've done is just phrase what I just said into a series of things that I could then put into a computer. This is what I want every password in the company to look like, and it's very easy to refer back to this and say, are you compliant? Are you not? But I won't go through this as I just did. One of the last slides here is reviews, exceptions, and consequences. It's an enormous part of how effective these policies are in real life. So the reviews, this is something that's going to be in a lot of audits, a lot of compliance frameworks about reviewing your password policy. You want to do this at least annually. That'll probably be enough for most of the time to get through those. But also, it's just good to know whether have computer cracking capabilities accelerated so much that maybe 12 months isn't enough. Maybe you want to do it every 6 months. This is something you can just decide yourself as a company, but just make sure that if you've changed the policy, communicate it out to everyone from top to bottom. Exceptions. This is the big one. Keep exceptions minimal and rare. You start to damage the foundation of your policy the more holes there are in it for specific people. Any exceptions should need double approval from the IT manager and the CISO, which means that usually one of them is being lent on and the other person can be the bad guy. But senior management are prime targets for phishing. They are prime targets for a specific kind of phishing called spear phishing, where it's all specifically detailed to that person. They're also the first people that are going to ask for policy exceptions because it makes their job just a little bit harder and a little bit more annoying. You have to stay the course. It will be those people that end up in the news, or it'll be those people's passwords that they go for. It's not going to be your highly trained IT guy. It's going to be the guy who's allowed to keep password 12345 6 because he's the CEO. So this is something that it's difficult to do in practice. It makes sense in your head, but it's much difficult to do it when it's the CEO asking you to do this. I would suggest standing firm if it's all possible. They are the prime targets for these kinds of attacks. Consequences: failure to adhere to the policy should result in the loss of system access. This should be something that violates your general acceptable use policy for a computer for any kind of organizational policy. That though takes us to the end of this webinar. So I'll hand back to Marina.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. I went ahead and dropped some links in the chat. And if you need any more information on this topic, please don't be afraid to click those links and look around if you need any more info. And I saw a couple of really good pieces of feedback. I know we're a little over, but I thought this would be so fun to share. So, in reference to the random number generator, Ben said, it's like picking six numbers of Powerball has greater odds than the pick three. And it costs you $2 for every guess. That's why people don't win the big money every week. And I think that's such a fun way to point out that numbers and how you generate them, important.
No, 100%. It's also it makes it more expensive to run the cracking operations too. Like it's enormously more expensive to crack a 12 character password than a 6. So it's an easy way of costing the attackers money if you want to think about it that way.
100%. Absolutely. Really insightful stuff. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. And I want to thank you, Matthew, for this awesome info on passwords and password policy.
No, thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, again, if anyone needs any more information on this topic, please don't be afraid to visit us at either of those links. And if you missed out on any part of this session, we will absolutely be sharing this recording with all of you in an email after the webinar. So be on the lookout for that. Alrighty. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Matthew.
No, thank you.
Alrighty. We'll see you all very soon, hopefully in the virtual classroom. Bye for now.